Hello, and welcome to this episode of ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environment, social, and governance. I'm your host, Mandi McReynolds, and today in our Climate Week series, we are discussing net zero emissions. Here talking about Intel's pledge and how the company plans to achieve its net zero goals is Todd Brady, Intel's Vice President, Global Public Affairs and Chief Sustainability Officer. He leads the global sustainability initiatives, including climate, energy, water, green buildings, and circular economy, and is focused on helping the company achieve its ambition. It is always a pleasure to have a fellow Chief Sustainability Officer on the show. Todd, welcome.
Great to be here, Mandi. Appreciate the invite. Look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. We're thrilled you are here. So let's dive right in. Intel has set some ambitious goals to address climate change. So let's walk our viewers through a little bit of the timeline. In May 2020, you laid out your 2030 ESG framework strategy and goals. And since then, you've adopted a new 2040 net zero, scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions goal. So let's focus on your net zero target. You said that your 2040 net zero goal builds on decades of work that you've done at Intel. So tell our listeners, why did you decide to adopt a net zero goal?
Yeah, well, the net zero goal has been a long time in the making. This is my 28th year at Intel. I joined Intel out of grad school, so I hate to admit that because you can figure out pretty quickly how old I am. I'm on the downhill part of life now, but my first job 28 years ago at Intel was to create emission models as an engineer to predict what the emissions were coming out of our fabs or our factories, and that included greenhouse gases. And the reason we did that is even 3 decades ago, we knew that we needed to proactively reduce our emissions. And so the net zero goal has literally been decades in the making as we've begun and have traveled down this journey of reducing our emissions. We began setting 10-year goals back in the 2010 timeframe. We achieved those in 2020, and then we set another set of 10-year goals to 2030. And then looking out even further, we said, hey, to get to net zero, it's going to take us even more than the next decade. And that's our 2040 goal that we shared just a couple of years ago.
Wow, 28 years. Most chief sustainability officers haven't had that opportunity to really be with a company that long. I would love to know, tell us how the groundwork influenced you setting the targets and the timelines and you being able to follow from the engineer to where you sit today.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons learned in this whole journey is tackling something like net zero is not something you can just do and within a year or two you're done. Particularly as you start looking at scope 1, 2, and 3 and the complexity and the enormity of that challenge, particularly for someone like Intel, which we're a major industrial manufacturer, a very complex operation, state of the art technology. And so we laid out a roadmap many years ago to begin working on the various elements of our net zero roadmap. That included, could we substitute certain chemicals that we were using in our manufacturing process? Could we abate those chemicals so keep them from being emitted into the atmosphere? That was our first focus for the kind of the first decade. The next decade, then we started looking at our scope 2, renewable electricity. And can we reduce or can we begin purchasing renewable electricity? Today, over 90% of our electricity around the world is renewable. So we're making very good progress there. If you add that to the steps that we took to reduce our emissions in the first place, net our emissions are down about 80% over where they would be. And this is over a time period that we've grown our company, obviously, many times over. Now, having said that, we still have a lot of work to do to tackle that remaining 20%. And that's going to require not only Intel doing additional activities, but getting our suppliers engaged, getting our vendors engaged, getting all of our key partners engaged to get to that last 20%, which is very challenging.
Couldn't agree more. Even as Workiva is on its own journey of progress towards net zero, we use that word very intentionally, progress, because you mentioned it well, that last 20%, there's a lot of hurdles, there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of additional partners to bring to the table. Help our audience maybe understand a hurdle or two that you're facing and how you think that's going to work through those to achieve your goals.
Yeah, I'll give a couple of examples. We just came out of Semicon West, which is a big trade conference for the semiconductor industry. And at that conference, we held a workshop with many of our key suppliers and said, look, here's our goals, here's where we want to go. We need you to join us in that journey. And we need you to set your own targets to achieve that. And we talked about the remaining chemistries that we needed to take a look at and things that we needed to do there to get further reductions in emissions. We launched a new program called Catalyze, which is to encourage our suppliers to invest in renewable electricity and create an easy method for them to get into this new world that can be very daunting for some. And so it's an example of where we have to work together in order to achieve the end goal of net zero.
So let's build on that a little bit more. You've talked about, as we prep for the show, companies fundamentally need to think differently about how they're going to get things done, and it's going to evolve from what the past has been. How do you see adopting this net zero pledge has driven business value for your organization and your stakeholders?
Yeah, I think there's several ways. One, we all know that climate change is the biggest environmental challenge that we have collectively. And so it's something that we have to tackle collectively to get there. And the business value is we hear regularly from our customers, we hear regularly from our investors, we hear regularly from our employees, from our communities in which we operate, that it's important to them as it's important to us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to address climate change. We have seen it as we track, year over year, the various trends that we have with our customers and purchasing requirements and whatnot. We've seen a clear uptick in the number of inquiries that we're getting from our customers about what we're doing to reduce our footprint. And in turn, they are getting those same queries from their end customers. So it's clearly a driver in the marketplace that people want to see companies taking action and they want to buy products that they feel from companies that they feel are taking those steps to reduce the footprint.
So, as you worked through this scope three emissions piece, you've added a net zero commitment by 2050. I would love for you to talk through some of those challenges. I think everywhere we go, we hear scope three, scope three, scope three. Every chief sustainability officer is yes, and scope three. So, how do you think we should approach this impact with our suppliers? You gave one really good example. Can we talk through maybe some other practical examples that you found to be successful?
Yeah, obviously, to make progress in this area, you have to measure. You have to know what your scope three is. And by the way, that's a challenge in and of itself, as I'm sure you know, in trying to determine your scope three emissions. So again, going back to we can't do it alone, we created a consortium called the Semiconductor Climate Consortium. And it has a number of different working groups, but one of the key working groups is scope three, and their first task is to align on how our suppliers are reporting their emissions, which turn into our scope three emissions. What we have found today, we ask our suppliers to go through CDP reporting and share the results with us. But what we found are wide variations in how companies are currently reporting. And so it's very challenging to really do apples to apples comparison sometimes and really understand what the full scope three footprint is. And so as an industry, we've said, hey, let's at least as a semiconductor industry, let's all get aligned on scope three definitions, what's in, what's out. And then we are at least being consistent. And then once you define that baseline, then you know what you can do to move forward and improve. So I think that's fundamental. And I know that that's not unique to our industry when it comes to scope three.
Tell our listeners more about this founding member of the Semiconductor Climate Consortium. I think that will be interesting to them, as you just mentioned, trying to set some standards together.
Yeah, particularly when it comes to things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, scope three emissions, we really see these as non-competitive. They're things that we've got to do collectively. And so we've had a long history of creating these consortia to address various environmental topics. I can remember we did this years ago with something that are called PFCs, perfluorinated compounds that we use in semiconductor manufacturing, got together to reduce those. We did it with lead, removing lead from electronic products. And then now we're doing it with the Climate Consortium. And so what we found is that by working together, we can have a far greater impact than working alone. And so we're a founding member of the SCC, Semiconductor Climate Consortium. I think we have over 80, approaching 100 members now throughout the supply chain. And there's just been a lot of tremendous enthusiasm around getting involved because everybody's facing the same issues. And so let's work through these together. Let's define standards, let's define definitions, let's define an industry roadmap for how we're going to get there.
Well, I think as you tackle scope 3, it's also looking at what's within reasonableness. I know at Workiva, we've sponsored with the UN Global Compact a partnership around SMEs because SMEs can make up a huge part of your supply chain, particularly as you try to diversify your supply chain, as you try to invest in more diverse businesses and small to medium sized businesses. And so it is that key of partnership that's going to move us all forward. And sometimes a great step forward for those listening in is what you just gave a beautiful example of: pick your lane, pick your area of influence that can really then move the needle, not only for yourself, but for the sector as a whole.
And Mandy, if I could just add to that, because it triggered another thought, the small businesses, you're absolutely correct. For big businesses like Intel, previously I mentioned that we've been able to procure over 90% of our electricity, 93% we ended last year, renewable. Well, we have an entire team that does nothing but contracts and negotiations and are specialized in utilities, come from that industry. And so we can go do that ourselves. However, a lot of our suppliers, particularly small suppliers, it's daunting to figure out how would I go and do that. And as we looked at our supply chain, the number one thing that we could do to begin reducing our scope 3 was to move more of our suppliers to use renewable electricity. And so that's why we launched this Catalyze program, which essentially makes it easy for the small business to procure renewable electricity because we provide them the tools, the consultants, the draft contracts, all the things that they need to make that happen. And so I do think we need to keep that in mind as we go forward, particularly as we talk about scope 3, is we do need to create mechanisms to help our suppliers achieve those goals.
Thanks for building on that. And as we think about Climate Week as a whole, there is a spotlight on energy efficiency. And one of your major initiatives is investing 300 million in energy conservation. So tell our listeners a little bit about this practice that you are working on.
Yeah, so this is building on an initiative we started many years ago, and I remember when we first started it. I think at the time I'd asked for a budget of $1 million, and I said, okay, if we have $1 million, let's open that up to engineers around the world, have them bring forward ideas for energy efficiency in our operations, and let's see what happens. And immediately we had far more projects that were submitted that had great energy savings, great return on investment than $1 million would fund. And I honestly, naively thought, oh well, okay, well let's just put a little bit more money into this, and within a few years we'll be done with energy efficiency. Well, that was 10, 15 years ago. So come forward to today, and we go, you know what? We've got a lot more that we can do on energy efficiency. And the wonderful thing about energy efficiency is not only does it address our sustainability goals and help reduce our carbon emissions, but it has a tremendous return on investment, return on our capital investment. And we found over and over and over again that many of the projects that we invest in will have a return of 3 years or less on average. That's a tremendous payback. Where else can you get that type of payback? And so you're addressing sustainability goals, you're reducing your carbon footprint, and you're helping your company's bottom line. I mean, that's just the perfect synergy when it comes to sustainability projects.
And it's one of the partnerships with organizations that you can think about is Workiva did an energy audit in partnership with our city. And sometimes it's not necessarily if you do big innovation challenges. For those listening on, it can be an energy audit is the place to begin. And you might find changing your light timers or doing some other elements or going on off-peak seasons can create those cost reductions. And these are simple, innovative solutions and problem solving that can add to the bottom line of your business. Let's take that idea of innovation and product a little bit further. I know you've done some work on the next generation of CPU, GPU, and Falcon Shores. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so clearly, when we look at our footprint, scope one, scope two, scope three, if you add in upstream scope three, so consumers using our product, our CPU, our chip that's in all of your computers and electronic devices and networking equipment and whatnot. If that electricity is not renewable electricity, low carbon electricity, then that by far is that's an order of magnitude larger than anything that we're doing in scope one, two, or downstream scope three. So the people using our product. Even I get confused in all the vernacular here. I feel bad for those who are not sustainability professionals. But anyway, the use of our product can have a very significant footprint. And so our focus here is we have a goal of being 10x more energy efficient for our server and client computing chips. And this is something that we see, again, aligns very well with the marketplace. Earlier, you asked about business value. Our customers and consumers want chips and want electronic products that are more energy efficient. Everybody wants a laptop that lasts not just a few hours, but all day or multiple days. Data centers that consume less energy but can still have high performance reduces the cost for the data center provider. And so, on and on and on. And so it makes a lot of sense to focus, and our chip designers are doing a wonderful job of this, of focusing on performance and energy efficiency. And you put those two together, you have a very compelling product, as well as you have a product that is sustainable as we go forward.
So, we spent the last several minutes talking about a lot of the complex parts of climate commitment. And there's a vast amount of dynamicness that happens in the data and the stakeholder engagement. I'm curious, as you mobilize technology and talent and process, how are you building confidence and trust in your ESG reporting as you prepare for compliance, knowing you have a net zero commitment?
Yeah, data and data integrity is critical. Just today, we announced our green bond report. So we issued a green bond last year, and we issued the first year report on where we're spending those proceeds. And all of that data has to be tracked and allocated. Increasingly, all of our reporting that we're doing, again, has to be tracked and allocated. Like many companies, we do third-party assurance on our annual corporate responsibility report and look at all of the data. So you need a strong platform to help you manage that data. Today we use one of Workiva's products. I don't even know if you're aware of that, but we use Wdesk, and we've used it for many years, and it's been very instrumental in helping us to organize, make that data auditable, and do our reporting in a way that we have strong confidence in it. And as you mentioned, it's just going to become more important as we go forward with new regulations coming out of both Europe and the U.S. And so we're just going to see more and more structure around data integrity when it comes to sustainability data.
Well, as you talk about technology, we cannot talk about technology and not talk about the other T, which is talent. And I'm curious, as a chief sustainability officer, how are you making sure the ESG teams are working together and staying on top of internal and external news to sort of track your goals? I was talking to our team this week and I was like, you cannot over communicate enough, right? Like with our internal stakeholders. And I'm just curious, one chief sustainability officer to the other, how are you challenging your talent?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things, and I know every company has different philosophies about this, but I firmly believe in having resources embedded in the various parts of our business as much as possible, as opposed to everybody being in my organization reporting into me. And what that does is to help drive that accountability and engagement, as you mentioned, with the talent that we have everywhere. And so we have sustainability professionals working in our software group, in our hardware group, in our manufacturing, in our R&D group, in our finance organization, in our supply chain. And so, one of my responsibilities, of course, is to bring that together and make sure that we have a cohesive strategy and that we're all working towards the same goals and setting those company-wide goals to get there. But I think that is a key attribute and talent that you need as a sustainability officer, is being able to manage resources which may not report to you, but are critical in order to achieve that end goal.
So global interest is for financial and non-financial reporting continues to grow. And let's say you have a crystal ball moment, right? You can potentially predict where you think climate disclosure is going and becoming mandatory. What do you see? What do you see happening?
It's just more and more disclosure, just more and more transparency. I mean, that's clearly the direction. I look back. I think we issued our first kind of corporate responsibility report. We didn't call it that back then, but reporting our environmental performance in 1994, the year before I joined Intel. And since then, you just see more and more and more, whether it's regulatory, whether it's investor interest, whether it's your customers or your community. I mean, just being transparent is clearly what we need to be doing as companies, and we feel very strongly about that. That we want to be as transparent as possible and disclose as much information as possible. And I think that trend is just going to continue.
Another veteran in this space with well over 20-year history, Paul Dickinson, co-founder of Climate Week, was recently on the show and spoke about how corporations' intention and climate will evolve. And he touched so greatly on this idea of public policy meeting innovation, meeting the strategy of a company coming together. I'm so curious from you, what advice do you have for companies listening to this series that haven't drawn a line in the sand yet and they haven't set a date yet for their targets? What's your key advice for them?
The obvious answer would be do it, right? Just don't drag your feet. Just do it. If you're not ready to jump all the way in, I get it. Again, we've been working on this for multiple decades, but you've got to draw a line in the sand and start setting some goals and targets. Clearly, in my mind, it's very clear where the world's headed and where we need to be headed, and so we have to take action. And I think you better position your company for success when you do your risk analysis and look at all the various factors out there. Being proactive and getting ahead of the upcoming risk is always the best answer, as opposed to waiting and being reactive. So I would much rather be proactive than wait and be acted upon. And so that would be my advice to companies that maybe have not done that yet. Take a look at your risk profile and see if it really makes sense to wait any longer.
All right, Todd, last question with Climate Week, and it's something that we're asking all of our guests in this series. Climate Week is driving action, and this year's tagline is "We can, we will." What does that theme mean to you?
I love it because I'm an optimist, and I know there's a lot of doom and gloom right now around the climate. We just had the hottest summer ever, right? And I live in Arizona, so we're certainly feeling it, right? In the Phoenix area, where we've had record heat over 110 degrees Fahrenheit for a month. But having said that, I'm incredibly optimistic. Are things moving as fast as we'd like? No, they're not, and we need to go faster. However, we are making progress. I just read a report that in the U.S. for the first time, wind and solar are now producing more electricity than coal. Right? That was a big headline. That's phenomenal. So we need to keep that momentum going. We need to keep going. And I just see everywhere I go and talk to my peers, just hundreds and hundreds. The private sector is really stepping up in this area. So if anything, there's kind of a call out to our government officials that, hey, let's quit the bickering and let's just figure out how to get some policies in place that move us in the direction where we need to. Because the private sector is on board in moving there. We see the risks associated with climate. We see the investments that are needed. We see the business value. And so I'm optimistic that we're going to get there.
Well, Todd, thank you so much for your optimism, your proactiveness, your legacy and leadership over the years as a Chief Sustainability Officer. It was such a pleasure to have you on, reflecting with us all on goals and ambitions towards net zero.
Thank you for having me, Mandi.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. If you enjoyed our Climate Week series over the last few weeks, I encourage you to check out a free virtual panel session Workiva just presented as a part of Climate Week's official programming and our Amplify user conference. I was joined by 3 incredible sustainability leaders to discuss ESG in the C-suite, strategy, governance, and risk management. See our show notes for the URL. In the meantime, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. We'll talk soon.